Do you guys remember playing with toys as a kid? So for me, it was probably the best thing ever back then. See, whenever I played with my toys, I'd always have some epic story. You know, I would just create this magical world in my head where all these crazy things happen with my toys. I mean, like, how fun was it to go into your own little world where you were the one that wrote the script and orchestrated the actions of your characters? It didn't matter that they weren't real and they were made of plastic, because in my head there was flesh and blood as me and you. I also remember seeing Star Wars for the very first time. Wow. The lightsabers, the lasers, the immense star destroyers, the space battles, like everything was just so intoxicating. Like the world was just so cool. And by the end of the film, I actually felt like I had become a part of the world. And I walked out of it feeling like, how can I do that? I really believe that in order to do that, you have to pull on people's heartstrings and make them feel things. You have to inspire people. And in order to inspire people, you have to tell a really, really good story in your art. So what exactly is the right story? It means knowing the characters and their world inside and out. Like, how does the world work? How does it function? These are all questions that you're going to need answers for if you want to create like a solid functional design inside of it. As soon as you get the answers to these questions, the story will actually write itself for you. Back when I was at Ubisoft, one of the writers from the movie Minority Report, he came in to give us a talk on storytelling. And for those of you that don't know, Minority Report is a movie. It's directed by Steven Spielberg, and it takes place in this really futuristic, utopian society. And without explaining the entire story, Tom Cruise's character becomes a fugitive on the run from the cops. So he's a fugitive on the run from the cops in a futuristic society. That one sentence alone holds a ton of questions in it. Like, how will the cops track him? Like, what types of technology will they use? And the writer said that the topic of eye scanners, like retinal scanners to track people, came up. So that created even more questions, like, how will Tom Cruise be able to evade the retinal scanners? And that's when they decided to have Tom Cruise surgically remove his eyes and get new ones implanted. And I thought that was one of like the coolest parts of the movie. So that's just one example of how after they had actually fleshed out the world and fully understood its inner workings, they had a more complete understanding of how the story would fit into the world. And the writer actually said that the story practically wrote itself after that. So we also have to compositionally direct the story through emotion. So you have to analyze your character's emotions. Like, how are they feeling in this specific scene? Your environment should represent the way that they feel. If they're feeling really sad about something, then that should be reflected in the palette that's chosen, in the composition, in the lighting, in the atmosphere. And you can see in this specific example from Skyfall in James Bond is traveling to a place in his childhood where his parents have died. So it's a really sad place for him. And you can tell just based off of the lighting, the atmosphere, the fog, the palette, everything just comes together to tell that story. You also have to understand the theme. Like, at its core, what is the story about? Like, what message are you trying to convey to your audience? And how does it translate into your art? So when you get a job in the game industry or the film industry, you can't just paint whatever you want. Like, you have to make something that's highly targeted towards the brand that you might be working on. Like, I can't just design a Marshmallow Kingdom for James Bond to fight his enemies in. It makes no sense. So I need to make something that emphasizes my character's unique attributes and abilities. In this example, he's in a casino because he likes to play mental games and dominate his enemies. So a game of poker between him and the bad guy makes so much sense for James Bond as a character. So pretty pictures, they're not everlasting. Like when I scroll through my Facebook feed and see a nice picture of like a cute little dog or a cat, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. Like I'll look at it and I might send it to my girlfriend. Oh, this is you as an animal. But 5 seconds later, nobody's going to care. It's not everlasting because it doesn't impact me in a really emotional way that pulls on my heartstrings. So here's a few tips and tricks as to how you can implement some of the things that we just talked about. You have to analyze the brand that you're working on for uniqueness. Like every brand is different. Like what's unique about it? Like what's interesting? What's the core fantasy of it? You need to understand its inner workings, like know exactly what makes the characters tick if you're going to make something that's memorable for your audience. You also have to immerse yourself in the lore of the world. So that means going to a comic shop, going to a library, watching films, studying reference, anything that will saturate your brain with everything that explains the art style and the characters, everything together, so that you really understand it and it forms a bit of a, I don't know, how do I say that? It forms a bit of a kind of library of your own inside of your head. So like I said, you have to study reference endlessly, and when I say study reference endlessly, I mean take hundreds of reference pictures inside of a folder and bombard your brain with images so that you've almost understood a new language, right? It's the same way that, like for me, if I was learning Spanish, that's how I would do it, right? I have to constantly input that information in my brain so that I can memorize it. And we also need to think about our environments as characters. They should reflect the specific traits of our characters and everything that makes our characters unique in terms of colors, shape language, composition, and abilities. So we've talked a bit about how visual aesthetic can be used to tell a story, but functionality is another key side to creating a really solid design. I have a few friends who are engineers in Quebec, in Canada, and all of them wear this ring on their pinky. And I found it a little bit odd at first, so one day I asked my friend Andrew why he wears the ring and why engineers wear them in general. And there's actually a really good reason. And it starts in Quebec in 1907, where a bridge collapsed, killing 75 construction workers. And back in the day in Canada, this was like a really, really big deal. And the collapse was actually attributed to poor engineering and poor planning. So engineers actually wear the ring as a reminder that the choices that they make in their designs can really have severe consequences on the world. So while our art can't actually kill people, I do believe that we also have a responsibility to inspire people with amazing stories, but at the same time, those stories, they need to work properly or else nobody will care. If we want to create something that feels believable, that creates the illusion that the viewer is actually a part of your art and a part of your world, we need to create designs that follow the exact same rules as the real world. We have to pretend that we're engineers and learn the inner workings of our creations. So we have to ask ourselves questions like, how's your product going to be used? Who's going to be using the environment? And in this example, you can see that this phone company, they decided to switch the keyboard. You can see it's A, B, C, D. Who uses a keyboard like that? It makes no sense. Like, since the invention of the typewriter, people have been using Q, W, E, R, T, Y. So this is the perfect example of somebody not actually thinking about who's going to use the product and how they're going to use it. So visual aesthetic only matters so much. And I use the phone in this example as, you know, it's just this really shiny, sleek, reflective iPhone like everybody got it, and everybody thought it was gorgeous. And it functioned really well, the interface was good, but the very first day that I bought it, I dropped it, and it was made out of glass and it broke. So it's just an example of, like, if your product isn't built to withstand the pressures of its use, then it's a bad design. We also have to think about, like, is it obvious what your product or your environment is? Like, it needs to look and feel the way that people expect it to. And shape is one of the best ways for people to recognize objects, so our silhouettes and form are extremely important. We can also create visual metaphors to enhance the narrative, enhance the story. So why exactly does Darth Vader's helmet seem so menacing? Why does he look so evil? It's because the designers actually took the shape language of an old Nazi helmet from World War II and integrated that into their design. They took something that we as an audience actually associate with death and destruction and encoded that so that we can instantly understand what message they're trying to get across narratively. You have to think about how your art can complement the gameplay. So if you're making a video game, there's a lot more questions that you have to think about, like how is the character going to interact in the environment? What special abilities does the character have, and how can you show them off in your environment so that you create a fun, meaningful experience? And just remember, like, you don't actually have to reinvent the wheel. Like, use the thousands of years of evolution to help you make your designs functional. Like, nature has it right. Like, there's a reason why a plane has the exact same shape as a bird. It's because nature has actually finely tuned the biology of a bird to be able to fly. So it makes natural sense that we would have to create a design that follows the exact same rules. And the exact same thing can be applied to engineering. There are certain rules that we must follow if we want to make something look and feel believable. So the more that we can borrow from modern engineering, the more grounded our designs will actually feel. So I thought we could just do like a little bit of a compositional refresher. Like, I know a lot of you guys kind of already know a lot of this stuff already, but it's really good to get some fresh eyes on it once in a while. So with balance, we want to balance our image so that our eyes can flow smoothly through our composition from point A to B. And we want to do it without allowing the viewer to become too distracted while on the way to our focal point. Every element that you add to your image has a certain visual weight to it. And based off of certain characteristics, those elements will attract our eyes a lot more to them. So we can actually use contrast and value to attract a viewer's eye to a specific location in our paintings. If you squint your eyes and look at this image, because the light is strategically placed behind the ship, it creates a ton of contrast and immediately draws our eye towards it. We can also use silhouettes. And looking at this environment, everything is really natural. Like, you have your mountain ranges, your valleys, and everything follows the exact same shape language until you introduce these discordant silhouettes, which immediately draw your eye because they're different from everything else in the image. So always use discordant shapes to lead the eye to specific locations. So discordant colors also create more visual weight, and your eye will naturally be a lot more inclined to look at them. So be very careful where you put them because you can really make or break your composition. And size holds a really key part in creating visual weight as well, because our eyes will almost always be drawn to the biggest object on the screen. So leading lines and directionality, every line and shape that you add to your image should be used to push the viewer's eye in a specific direction. And doing this is a really great way of leading them from point A to B, or to allow them to travel through your composition and find your focal points. So line intensity and width. When you think about line intensity and width, you usually think of a term called line weighting in comics and graphic design, and you can see it in action right here. On the left, it's a little bit bland, but as soon as you add more variety to the line widths, it becomes a lot more interesting. Line intensity can actually be applied to any image. And it's just about creating visual contrast. We want to create as much variety in it as possible and add some differing shapes and values because it just adds a bit of visual harmony and makes our composition a lot more interesting. So symmetry and repetition, they're actually found everywhere in nature. When we look at plants and trees, even the street, the road is symmetrical, the light poles are symmetrical, windows, buildings, and it's just, we're so used to looking at it that it's really visually pleasing to us, and it grounds us in the reality a little bit more. And a key is to actually break the repetition at a point of interest, namely your focal point. So depth, that's another really important one. It helps to give us a sense of 3D realism. So if we add the foreground, midground, and background levels, it really sucks us in to the painting and makes us feel like we're a part of it. And we can really use it to emphasize scale and distance, how small and big things are. So one of the main compositional tools that a concept artist will actually use in the game industry or the film is the rule of thirds. And it's pretty much where you add a 3x3 grid over top of your painting. And what you want to do is put your focal point at one of the intersection points, your balancing element at another one, and it's just a really good way of balancing your image and adding a really kind of visually pleasing aesthetic to it. There's also the golden ratio. It's kind of this spiral swoop, and if you use your directionality in your image and your values to go around and eventually lead at this one point, that will actually create a really visually pleasing flow. And you can kind of see it here. It's all of the directionality pulls you, and you eventually just end up at that one beautiful point that gives the viewer a little bit of a payoff towards your image. There's also triangular composition. So triangles as a shape are extremely visually pleasing. And when we actually start adding points to them, we can create convergence points that immediately pull your eye in specific directions. So I wanted to talk a little bit about color because it's an integral part of integrating emotion into our images, and it can be used as a really powerful storytelling mechanism. So it's usually associated with brand awareness and psychology, and because of our experiences, color affects our psychology in different ways. So you have to be very, very strategic about how you use it. Because of time, I'm not really going to go into the specifics of exactly what each color does and how it makes you feel, but there's a ton of resources online where you can find out all that info. So how can color tell a story? It can symbolize the inner workings of our characters. It can also show the evolution of theme. Characters evolve throughout stories. The colors that we use in our environments must mimic that evolution. In the movie Pleasantville, our characters are transported into this reality it's trapped in the 1950s. All the characters have this really old-fashioned way of thinking and societal rules that can't be broken. But as the story evolves, so do the characters. And throughout the progression of the film, everything slowly becomes more colored as they all wake up and discover their passions in life. It can also separate place or time. So in the film The Matrix, the real world has a palette that's a very harsh blue, and it's meant to symbolize a really harsh, war-torn reality where machines have actually taken over the world and destroyed everybody. But on the other hand, inside of The Matrix, they use a palette that's a lot more green, and it's actually meant to symbolize this kind of monotonous existence of the inside of this computer program. So using the color palette like this is a really powerful way of making it really obvious to the viewer what time or place they're actually in. You can also use focal elements with color. So in the movie Schindler's List, it's a very sad, appalling tale about the Holocaust during World War II. everything in the film is actually black and white. And it's black and white until you actually see this little girl that's all in red. And just from that slight bit of color, you can instantly tell that something important is happening for our main character, Liam Neeson. The discordance of the color on the black and white instantly draws our eyes to it. It can also be used to tell good versus bad, who the light Jedi is and who the Sith Master is. And remember, like, its main purpose is to actually make you feel things. So it's a great way of telling a story. So I thought we could do a case study on how colors can actually be used to symbolize the inner workings of our characters. And I chose a scene from the TV show Breaking Bad. So just a little bit of context. Walter White, who is this guy right here, he's a brilliant chemist. And throughout his life, he kind of didn't fulfill his dreams, and he turned into this depressed school teacher. And shortly after the show begins, he actually discovers that he has lung cancer. He actually begins to cook methamphetamines as a way to financially provide for his family. And as the series progresses, he becomes slowly more involved in this life of crime. So in this specific scene that we're about to watch, Walter's wife, Skylar, is very scared about their family actually being murdered by Walt's boss, who's this massive drug kingpin. And she's suggesting that they go to the cops. It doesn't go the way that she planned.
We go to the police.
No, I don't want to hear about the police.
I do not say that lightly. I know what it could do to this family, but if it's the only real choice we have, if it's either that or you getting shot when you open your front door,
I don't want to hear about the police.
You're not some hardened criminal, Walt. You are in over your head. No. That's what we tell them. That's the truth.
No, it's not the truth.
Of course it is. A school teacher, cancer, desperate for money.
Okay, we're done here.
Roped into working for, unable to even quit. You told me that yourself, Walt. Jesus, what was I thinking? Walt, please, let's both of us stop trying to justify this whole thing and admit you're in danger.
Who are you talking to right now? Who is it you think you see? Do you know how much I make a year? I mean, even if I told you, you wouldn't believe it. Do you know what would happen if I suddenly decided to stop going into work? A business big enough that it could be listed on the NASDAQ goes belly up. Disappears. It ceases to exist without me. No, you clearly don't know who you're talking to, so let me clue you in. I am not in danger, Skylar. I am the danger. A guy opens his door and gets shot, and you think that of me? No. I am the one who knocks.
So our point of view character is, he's turning to the dark side of the Force, you know? So when the scene starts, he's wearing red to symbolize his growing anger at being questioned by his wife. And as his anger consumes him and his need to be recognized for his accomplishments overcomes him, he takes off his shirt, revealing this even deeper, darker red. His evolution to the dark side has become complete. And Skylar, his wife, knows that the man that she married and loved is gone. He's long gone. So I found this color chart online that shows the palette of the main character's clothing for each episode of the entire series. If you look carefully and match up the colors with the episodes, you'll notice that every single color for every single character is very strategically chosen to symbolize how the character is feeling in any given scene. At the start of the series, Walter White he's very bland, you know, his life isn't going the way he wants it to, but as it progresses, he becomes a lot more dark, and as he gets more involved in the drug scene, his life becomes more intense, and so do the colors. So camera angles are extremely important. They can be used to emphasize the character's point of view and show them how they're feeling. It can add or remove power from our subject matter, and it can also be used to really enhance the emotion that the viewer feels or that the character is feeling in the scene. So we have our eye level angle, which is narratively neutral. It doesn't really give power or take power away from our subject matter. We also have low level angle. It's kind of makes you feel like a child. You're looking up at your dad, and it immediately removes power from you as a viewer. And it can be used for oppressive environments or environments where we want the point of view character to feel like they're being clamped down or the noose is tightening around their neck. So we also have high-level angles, which remove power from our subject matter. This actually is used to signify weakness in our main character, and it's a good way to show them at their weakest point throughout the film or in your image. And it really promotes oppression. So we also have center framing, and it's used to promote an element of grave importance. That one thing in the center of the frame that you need to look at right now, it's right there. So just a few tips. Brainstorm your narrative into your composition and find interesting ways to translate it. Think about your theme. Like, what exactly is the underlying message that you're trying to tell? And translate your character emotions into your environment through the use of lighting, color, atmosphere, and composition. And use your camera angles really wisely. They'll promote the narrative, and they'll suck the viewer's eye into it and really reinforce the story that you're trying to tell. So I thought we could talk a bit about James Bond and how our environments can actually cater to the unique traits of our characters. So there's this thing called core fantasy, and core fantasy is actually just the key elements that make up the experience of the product that you're making or working on. And it really symbolizes like what is actually interesting about the reality that you're trying to create and what are the core tenets of that. So for James Bond, one of them is exotic locations. Like, he travels all over the world. He goes to places we only wish we could go. He's a total badass. He has high-tech gadgets. He actually has $40,000 suits. My girlfriend is actually in fashion, and she told me that he wears Tom Ford suits, which are anywhere between $25,000 to $40,000. Just insane. And he has endless weapons and unmatchable skill in martial arts. He gets the babes in every single film. He has this suave, sophisticated charm to him, and he has exquisite sense of fashion and taste. And he's like way too good at getting girls. Like, nobody is as good as James Bond is. So what exactly are his weaknesses? One of them is women. Half the time they end up betraying him in the film. Overindulgence, and this is actually used a lot more in the film Skyfall, because he almost becomes a bit of a drug addict in the beginning of the film. And he kind of has to transform himself from this old kind of dog that's been beaten up and spit out and into this back into the 007 agent that he was in the beginning of the film. And his other weakness is arrogance. He thinks he's way better than everybody else at everything. And his enemies actually use that a lot of the time against him. So his powers, he outsmarts his enemies, and he really wants to dominate them physically and mentally. He gets hurt and continues on anyways. He has gadgets, and his main power, actually, is that he looks cool doing almost anything. So I wanted to do a study on the movie Spectre, specifically the intro of it. And there isn't really much context that you need to know. It's just James Bond. He's in Mexico City. You'll see.
Where are you going?
I won't be long.
So you could see that he gets the girl and immediately leaves in typical James Bond fashion with a single line of dialogue, "I won't be long." He travels through the environment, sauntering, and he's kind of framed like a god among mere mortals. You could see like he's above everything, and he's cooler than anything else. A pathway is clearly defined for him, and there's this series of events that have been carefully constructed just for him so that he doesn't have to expel too much effort away from looking cool. See, James Bond doesn't actually jump down rooftops unless he absolutely has to. The environment is actually created in such a way that he can do what he does best, look like the ultimate badass. So just remember that something as simple as a vent can contribute to the story if it has the proper functionality. You have to think about questions like, how can the character interact with it? How does he feel about it? Like, what can you ask yourself about it that will help tell the story that you need to? You just kind of have to figure out how. Remember that researching your characters will help you to create the perfect world just for them and help you to tell that story, not any story, that one. And in conclusion, I thought I would actually end with a quote from Maya Angelou. "I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel." I want you guys to pull on people's heartstrings by reflecting the emotions and traits of your characters in the lighting, composition, and elements that you add to your scene. Pretend that you're that kid playing with his toys. Create a world that tells a story as epic as Star Wars. Make something memorable. Thank you.